Well, church, we're going to take the next few weeks and we are going to delve into a story that we have looked at several times as children growing up, and I know the ladies have dissected this before in their past as well. But I think there's some interesting things that we find out from the book of Esther. And so for the next few weeks, we're going to talk about some of those different things about Esther that mean so much to us. How is it possible that a book that was even argued on if it should even be in the Old Testament could give us so much knowledge? A book that does not have any direct influence from God in there. There's no mention of God inflecting his will in what's going on. There's no mention of different ceremonies or sacrifices being done. Why is this book so important to us that it sits in the middle of the Old Testament as part of the history of the Jewish people, and what can we actually learn from it? This morning, one of the main things I want to make sure that we understand as we go through this, and I'm going to take some time to just lay out the story and kind of give you like the Netflix short version of sometimes, when you find a new movie and you want to read about it, see if it's something you want to actually watch, you get a few little blips and pieces of it and you start trying to figure out, yes, something I want to get into or not. I really want to encourage you, church, that this week, because we're going to be going over this story for a few weeks, that if you've not actually taken the time to read the book of Esther, if you've only heard it through your Bible classes or short snippets through sermons or things of that nature, that you take some time this week and read this story. I'm going to lay it out for you this morning on some different things. We're going to talk about 4 different truths and what that does to our faith. I want to start out by just kind of giving you the 5 main characters as we're going through these and dropping in the truths as we go. The first character that we find in the story is Xerxes. Xerxes is giving us a lot of information about him as it begins in Esther 1 and 2. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. Xerxes, who ruled over the province stretching from India to Cush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And if we don't know our geographics and our layouts, that doesn't seem like that big of a deal until you get on a map and you look at India to Egypt and you realize Xerxes ruled over it all. Xerxes was an incredibly powerful king. He had incredible wealth beyond description. He had more people following him and underneath his rule than we could even imagine. And it begins us with our first truth. It doesn't matter how corrupt the power of this world becomes, God is always sovereign. Xerxes, who had nothing to do with God at all, who had nothing in his history with it at all, did not acknowledge God in any way, had incredible amounts of power, and was corrupt beyond belief. As you go in and you read the beginning of Esther, you start seeing how despicable Xerxes truly was and how full of himself he really was. In the beginning of the story, you start to see that Xerxes is throwing this elaborate party to show off his wealth to all the different leaders and followers of him that were important. You see that they literally were partying for weeks on end. And after a long period of time of partying, he begins to start showing off in different ways, and it sets our story into motion. Our second character that we want to look at this morning is Vashti. Did we miss one here? Okay. Vashti. In verses 11 and 12, it tells us a little bit about her. She's the queen. Verse 11, he calls for her to bring Queen Vashti wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious, and he burned with anger. And we find that there's this beautiful and incredible queen. And there's a woman who is beautiful beyond belief, and he has been drinking with his friends, and he has been doing all these things with his friends, and he's decided that he's going to show off his prized possession. Have her put on her crown and dance for the masses. Show off her body and display herself so that everybody can see the incredible power that I have and that I own the most beautiful of things. And here's a woman who has decided that she will not be his token pawn. And when he calls for her to come and do the things that she has too much pride to do, that she actually stands up for herself, it makes him angry. She has made him look bad in front of his friends. She has put him in his place, and he does not like this. As a matter of fact, it angers him so much that he starts taking steps to punish her for what she has done. Our third character that we want to look at, that's going to be in our story this morning, is Haman. In Esther 3, 1 and 2, it lets us know a little bit about him. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, an Agagite, elevating him and giving him the seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. And so we find out there's another character in our story. He has done the king's bidding. He has gotten the king's favor. He's been put into high esteem inside this corrupt time, and now everyone is to give him respect. Everyone is to bow down to him. You know, this week, there's a very famous person who died over in England. The Queen's husband passed away this week, and it's been all over the news. And one of the stories that I heard that I thought was so fascinating was that whenever he was getting married to her, she required him to kneel to her because she was the queen. And the report is that he didn't want to do it. Here was a man who had been in the military, who had done incredible things for the country, who had a lot of respect of so many soldiers, who was giving up his military career to be married to the queen. Didn't think twice about it because of his love for her. And she asked him, no, she demanded him that he would give her the respect due, and that he would kneel to the queen, his wife. And he did, because that was his place. And I look at this story this week as we are looking at Mordecai, and Haman is coming to the gate, and as he comes to the gate, everyone drops, and everyone kneels. It reminds me whenever I used to watch the shows about Japanese culture hundreds of years ago, that whenever the rulers would come in, that they would all bow down and they would give respect. But Mordecai would not bow. Which leads us to Mordecai, one of our other characters. In Esther 2, 5 through 7, it lets us know a little bit about him. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, and it tells us so much right there, doesn't it? Named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, and whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother had died. And it tells us a lot about the kind of man that Mordecai is. Can you see how the story is starting to unveil? If you're reading your previews for the movie, you're starting to figure out who's the good guys and who are the bad guys. At first you look at it and you think, well, maybe Mordecai is that guy that, he's defiant, he's that rebel, he's the one that's not going to do the thing that needs to be done. And then they start laying out who Mordecai is. He's a good man. He's a godly man. He's the man that saw a need in his family. And not only did he take in someone in his family because their parents had passed away, but he treated them like his own daughter. And he loved her. And this story goes on, and we look. Verse 21 through 23. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, two of the king's officers who had guarded the door became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of Annals, in the presence of the king. And we start to see even more about Mordecai. That even though he is in captivity, even though he is in a sense where he has somebody who is an ungodly person ruling his world around him, as he sits there, he hears of injustice in this corrupt, messed up world. And instead of allowing the injustice to happen, he does the right thing. He informs Esther about what's going on and saves the king's life. Esther 4:13 through 17. He sent back his answer, "Don't you think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all Jews will escape? For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position in such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, "Go gather together all the Jews in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this was done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." And as we start to look inside this story, there's a fifth character in the midst of it, and her name is Esther. And we know through the story that Esther, when the king decides to punish Vashti, he banishes her from his presence, and he's looking for a new token wife. And he sends out the call, and he sends out his people to find the most beautiful maiden that there was that they could find. And they gathered up the most beautiful ladies in the kingdom. They brought them there, and they prepped them and got them prepared to be seen by the king over time. And Esther is the one that he chose. And she followed and did what she needed to do. And this whole time, the reason why Mordecai was sitting at that gate was because, just like a good father would, he was looking over his daughter, making sure that she was okay. And Esther, when she hears the plot, is concerned. And Mordecai reminds her in the scripture, "Do you think that you can get away from the wrath that comes to our people?" See, what has happened is Haman has gotten angry at Mordecai. Haman has frustrated that Mordecai would not bow to him. And he knows that Mordecai is a Jew. And so Haman lays out a plan to get rid of Mordecai. But not just Mordecai. Haman lays it out so that he will get rid of all the Jews. And when Mordecai hears what's going on, he pleads to Esther to please go talk to the king. You have to do something, or else we're all going to die. So Mordecai went away and he carried out all of Esther's instructions. We come to our second truth. God always has kingdom insiders. And you are one of them. He wants to use you to dispel darkness and throw light into your world. You need to understand in the midst of this dark world that we're in that you are an insider. You are in the world, but you are not of the world. God has you planted right where he needs you at the right time so that at that time you may step up and shine light and give glory to God in the midst of everything happening. Remember what we said? The story isn't really even about us. It's about him. It's always about God and God's plan. As much as we want to look at the story, we say, oh, it's really just about Esther and in her incredible ability to step up at a time. It's not. It's about how God uses his people to bring along what needs to be done. And sometimes those are insiders that do that. As we look a little bit further, we see what Haman does as he begins to make the gallows to get Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, calling together his friends of Zeresh, his wife. Haman boasted to them about the vast wealth of his many sons and all the ways the king had honored him and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have a pole set up, reaching to the height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go to the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set. In the midst of all the glorious things that he had been given and everything that he accomplished, there was one thing that was burning up inside of him. There was one thing that he couldn't control. And then the reality of our world is that our world looks at us and they want so desperately to control us as Christians, to put us in our box and tell us what we are able to do and not do, to tell us when we are to bow and when we are to do what they say. But God calls for us to follow him and not the world. God calls for us to stand up for him and only him. And in the midst of that, sometimes that puts us on to be a target. And Mordecai was his target. But God had a bigger plan. When we look, we find that here God starts to intervene. That night the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this, the king asked. Nothing has been done for him, this attendant answered. The king said, Who's in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court to the palace to speak to the king about the impaling of Mordecai on the pole that he set up for him. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, Have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and his horse the king has ridden, the one with the royal crest plated on his head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to the one the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights in honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what has been done for the man the king delights to honor. Oh, he's got it all planned out. What would I want? You see Haman in his mind. What would I want? What would be the greatest thing ever? I know. If I could wear his robe, and if the entire city saw how great that I was, that's what we should do. Thinking it was all for him. Go at once, the king commanded Haman, get the robe and the horse, and do just as you suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's side gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. And we look, and all of a sudden, isn't it ironic that this king who has not a worry in the world says, bring me the history books, bring me a recording, and let's just happen to read this one passage about this one thing that happened on this one day, about the one guy that Haman is coming tomorrow to try to kill. God so incredibly having a big part of this big picture. And Haman, in the midst of all of his arrogance, lays out all the wonderful things he'd like to have, only to see it in his fingers and run right through his fingers to fall upon the one man in the entire country that he could not stand. The one that he could not rule over. The one that would not play by his games. He was honored. And so many times we need to realize that that is us. When we stand up for God, that he brings honor to us. The third thing we need to know, the truth in the story is this: God will work in mysterious and sometimes silent and spiritual ways to bring his purpose. That's our God. That's the way he does things. So many times he quietly sits and makes things happen, and we look at that and go, what a coincidence. That's just amazing. Who would have thought that that could ever happen? God did. And that's one of our truths that we need to hold on to. And finally, Haman's plot is exposed, and he is dealt with. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king asked again, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Can you imagine? I want to give you half of a continent because I love you so much. You've thrown such a great party for me. You make me feel so special. I'll give it all to you, honey. What would you want? Just tell me what you want. You name it and you get it. But Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. Oh, what? This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing. Esther said, an adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman realized the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Here's the guy that was ready to kill her uncle because he wouldn't kneel. And where does he find himself? Begging the queen for mercy. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining, the king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in my house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. The Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house." He had set it up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. It lays us to our fourth truth. God is the real hero of your story. Whether you believe it or not, he's been working in your life the whole time. See, in the midst of the story, the true hero is God. God laid out things to happen the right way. That when his people followed his ways, when they did the right thing, when they took the time to fast and to pray to him, when they took the time to follow him, when they stood up for him and what is right instead of what is socially correct, God stood up for them, and he was their champion, and he was their hero. And he took care of not only Mordecai, but all of his people, because that's what God does for his people. And it teaches us some things about faith. Esther taught us some really great lessons about faith. First, you need to understand that you are chosen. In Psalms 103, it says, "Know that the Lord is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people. We are the sheep of his pasture." We need to understand that you are a chosen people. God chose you. More importantly, Jesus chose us. When Jesus died on that cross, he chose you. He left a door open for you. He allowed our faith to grow through his sacrifice, through his giving of himself. Secondly, we need to accept the challenge. If you look in Esther 4:16 again, it says, "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in the Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days or night. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done," look what she says, "I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." The challenge was, if you don't do something, we'll be wiped out. There was a challenge, just like the challenge that we face today. If we as the church do not go and tell the gospel, if we do not share our faith, it is only a short amount of time before we will no longer recognize Christianity where we live. God will continually live on places where people share their faith, but he will not if we do not where we live. And it's a challenge. And sometimes it can be scary. And sometimes we could be nervous about it because we don't know what's going to happen. But in this story, when we read the full story, we start to understand what Esther is saying. Because at that time, you didn't just approach the king, not even the queen. It was only by request that you even got to see the king, let alone ask him for something or give him an ultimatum. But she says, "I will go to the king. Even if it costs me my life, I will go to the king." I accept the challenge. When we step out on our faith, first we need to understand that we are a chosen people of God. Secondly, we need to accept the challenge that lies before us. Whenever they first started playing the game of golf, great game. If you watched the golf this last week, there was a guy who was golfing this week, and as he was hitting down the fairway off the side by a tree, he hit it, and as he sliced just a hair, about 150, 200 yards down the way was his father, who was standing there watching him, and the ball hit his father this week. Great moment in golf right there. Repeated over and over and over again, talked about over and over again. In the original golf balls didn't have the little dimples that they have today. When they made the original golf balls, they were somewhat smooth. And they were made and they looked like this. However, the more that you played golf with those balls, they started to get these rough spots all over them. They started getting these indentions when they would hit the ball over a matter of time. And what happened, they realized, was that with these indentions, the ball actually flew better and would go further with these imperfections in them. Until finally now, the golf balls that we see today look like this. With an incredible amount of indentions, and maybe we call them rough spots. And it lets us understand something, that it takes some rough spots to make us go further. And as Christians, sometimes in the midst of our faith and what we're doing, we need to go through patches of rough spots. We need to go through some trying things, some hard things. We need to get roughed up a little bit in our faith because it makes us stronger. We have to go through a few trials and tribulations so that we can cling on to our faith, that we can hold on to what God gives us as truths. And as we do that, we start going further and deeper in our faith. We get more knowledgeable. We become a better player in God's game of life. It's only through those moments that we become what God wants us to be. There's nobody that plays with a smooth golf ball anymore. In Isaiah 41:10, it says, "So do not fear. I am with you. Do not be dismayed. For I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." And he says, don't be afraid to take that challenge. I've got you. I will take care of you. Have faith. Thirdly, we need to be able to choose to face our fears. In Esther 4:16, she says again, "I will go to the king even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." She faces her fear. Her fear is death. But she steps on it full force, right on. What is your fear today? What is the fear that holds you back from sharing the Word of God? What is your fear that stymies your faith? God calls for you to jump at it, to hit it full force, to go headstrong onto it and know that He's got you, that He can take care of you. We need to understand that fear is a control issue. And it's the opposite of trust. If I'm fearful, it means I have a lack of trust. I've told you this before, that Malachi, my little one, he loves the idea of going swimming, but is terrified of water. All he wants to do is for me to take him to go swimming. And I get in the pool with him. For 30 minutes, I have to convince him that the water will not hurt him. And if I get frustrated, he cries because he wants to be in the water. And if I put him in the water, he cries because he's afraid of the water, because there's a lack of trust. There's a desire, but a lack of trust. He's still trying to build faith into the idea. But once I have him in the water, and once I've got him and I'm holding on to him, he becomes free. His faith in me becomes stronger. He becomes more free, and over time I can take him over to the first step. And we have that moment when I go, I'm just going to hold your hand, and he gets rid of the death grip on my neck. And I let him stand on the first step with his feet in the water, and I say, I'm going to let go of your hand, and then he grabs my neck, and it hurts real bad. And I say, okay, I'll just hold your hand. But over time, he'll jump on the first step, and he'll sit on the first step, and then he'll talk to me for a month about how great it was to be on that first step. Fear, it's a control issue. Playing God is the root of all of our fears when it comes to our faith. When we try to play God, it's where we become fearful. When we start to think that we have control of what's going on, when we think that we can dictate what happens, we are trying to play God. And that's when we become afraid. When we play God, we trust ourselves instead of trusting Him. Well, God, I know you said that that's what I need to do, but the situation I'm in today, it's so difficult. God calls for us to have faith and put our faith in Him and not in ourselves. And finally calls us to step out in our faith. Fear puts our circumstance between God and us, while faith puts God between our circumstance and us. That's the big difference, people. Fear is what separates us from God. But God separates us from the thing that we're afraid of. God protects us from the thing that we are most afraid of. Instead of letting that thing drive a wedge between you and God and your faith, when we lean on God, He drives a wedge from the fear that we have. And as we look into Esther, we start to see that God, through her faith, through Mordecai's faith, does something really incredible. We start to realize that we all have the Esther story as well. We all in our lives are laid before situations. And we have those moments when the world calls for us to bow. And we have to decide yes or no. We have to decide who we follow, who will lead us, and whose destiny do we trust. And understand that God does have control. And as much as we think sometimes our lives is really just about us, there's something bigger than ourselves out there. There was something bigger than just Mordecai standing up for himself. There was something bigger than just Esther going and having a party and talking to her husband. The decisions that we make affect everyone around us. Through our faith, we allow God to be something bigger. Paul says it this way, John says it this way, I must become less so that He can become more. He is the bigger picture. Esther teaches that life is bigger than just ourselves. And this is the beginning of us looking into the book of Esther. Like I said, I want you to take some time this week to read up on it more, so as we go into more of this and you see more things, that you'll be familiar with this story. Hopefully this has been a reminder to you about this incredible story. Our story. The story that God laid out for us to see. The story that we live on a daily basis. Is today the day that your faith is restored? Is today the kind of day that you just need a friend to hold your hand and say, we're here for you? That's what we're here for as a church. Are you the Mordecai of the story? Are you the Esther? Because there are times when you have to make really hard decisions in life. Just as Esther did, but she didn't do it alone. When it was time to make that hard decision, she called on those around her, her people, to fast, to be there with her, to help prepare her, to know that she wasn't alone when she had to make a hard decision. This morning, can we help you with that? Are you in the midst of having to make a hard decision in life? You don't have to do that alone. God laid out His people here for you so that you don't have to do that alone. If you need your family to pray for you today, if you need anything this morning, will you allow us to do that as we stand and as we sing?